G'day. I'd like to talk to you today about 3 reasons why podcasts fail and 3 things that you can do to ensure that your podcast isn't one of them. But I want to quickly start by showing you some statistics. Now, these are from Apple Podcasts, which is one of the bigger podcast directories, so we can safely assume that this trend is likely to occur across other podcast directories as well. But about 12 months ago, there was around 850,000 podcasts on Apple. Now that number is over 1.7 million podcasts. It has doubled in the last 12 months. But it's interesting to note that only 39% of those podcasts are active. That just means that they've released an episode in the last 90 days. So there's still, of course, going to be plenty of podcasts which haven't released an episode in the last 90 days. They'll still, of course, be available on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. They'll still be getting downloads, still potentially be popular, but that active measurement only takes into account the podcasts which have released an episode in the last 90 days. It's interesting to note on the right-hand side of that screen too, that 51% of podcasts, if we look at the right-hand side of that pie chart there, 51% of podcasts have 5 or less episodes. So if we look at those two statistics, only 39% of podcasts have released an episode in the last 90 days, and most podcasts have 5 or less episodes. It seems to suggest that there's something difficult about the longevity of podcasting. There's something about keeping it going which makes it difficult. Why is that? Well, I want to talk to you today about 3 things that I think people do to make it more difficult for their podcast to continue. And then also, of course, 3 things that you can do to ensure that your podcast gets well beyond the 5 episode mark. So what are those 3 things? First one, unclear goals. The second, no call to action. And the third is that they don't recognize success. So unclear goals. Now, the first point there is arguably the most important in many ways. What outcome do I deliver? It's so important to be delivering an outcome for your podcast, even if you're informal or informative. You got to think in terms of an informative podcast, you can get information from just about anywhere on the internet these days. Information is so accessible. So what is it about your podcast that is going to provide people with the best source of that information? What are they going to receive from your podcast? What takeaway will they get from your podcast? You've got to think even in terms of if you have a very informal podcast. Let's think of Hamish and Andy, for example, very famous Australian podcasters. Well, their outcome is still it might be to transport people to a different environment. It might be to accompany people while they're driving or they're completing a menial task around the house, like a chore. It might be to make them feel like they're one of the gang and so they've got friends in Hamish and Andy in that sort of sense. So even in that most informal, seemingly informal podcast where they don't necessarily have a set structure or any of that sort of stuff, they're still delivering outcomes. Second question there is, why am I the best host for this podcast? If you're not the best host for your podcast, arguably that's someone else's podcast and maybe that's not the exact podcast that you should be doing. I like to think of this in terms of, why am I the best guide for this podcast? Why am I the best guide for my audience? What set of values, what experiences have you gone through in your life to make this important for you to talk about? As I said before, information is so accessible these days. You can get it from just about everywhere. But what set of experiences have you been through in your life that have shaped your passion for what you're talking about, that have shaped the importance of exactly what you're talking about in your life? Because the more you're able to get that across to your audience, the more they will identify with you as a kindred spirit, for lack of a better term, the more they'll advocate for your podcast, pass it on to their friends who may also be in a similar situation, and the more your podcast will grow from there. And the third aspect of unclear goals is, why exactly am I doing this? What am I trying to achieve with this podcast? Because if you've got a podcast and you're simply trying to sell your book, you may have written a book, and you're simply trying to sell as many copies of your book as possible, well, that podcast is going to look very different to someone who may be working in a niche service area. They may have a high-level premium service offering, and their podcast may be about wanting to get more clients and book more clients in that high-level premium offering. Well, those 2 podcasts are potentially going to look very different. I'll discuss this a little bit later on, but it's very important to tie why we're doing our podcast to the goals that we're trying to achieve in the first place. Now, for the second reason that podcasts fail, no clear call to action. What are the next steps? As we've just spoken about, you've achieved an outcome for your audience. They identify with you as a unique presenter. What else can you put in place to ensure that people have material to consume, to ensure that people have a way to get in touch, to potentially ask you questions, to potentially learn more about resources that were discussed on that episode of the podcast? What else can you have in place to, I've heard it described before, allow people to put up their hand as a listener of your podcast, to potentially to communicate with you, to give their feedback? The more of that in place, which leads us to our second point here, the more you also signal to your audience that you're legitimate about this, that you're serious about keeping this podcasting thing going and you want them to be involved, which takes us to our third point, which is to invite them in. Allow your audience to be involved. I heard a quote once that podcasts trade on the currency of connection, and I think it's a great quote, and I think it's so true. As we were talking about before, you're the unique host of your podcast. No one is going to be able to get that anywhere else. So they're going to want to identify with you. They may want to get in touch with you. They're going to want to be an advocate, an open advocate for your podcast if you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of delivering them value. So you've got to find a way with some of these systems in place to invite them in and to signal to your audience that you want them to be a part of it. Third reason podcasts fail is that they don't recognize success. And the first point I want to talk about there is what actually is a podcast listen. Because you hear people lament at times, I put out a podcast episode and I only got 10 listens. But if you put out a 40-minute podcast episode and 10 people have invested the time to listen to that from start to finish, well, potentially that could create a hell of a lot of opportunities down the line in a business sort of sense. You think the potential lifetime value of a customer is absolutely priceless. And the medium of podcasting is such that it gives you such an opportunity to have the undivided attention of that person, to really have their time invested into you. They may be doing something else at the time, of course, but you are essentially who they've chosen to give that period of time to. So even if you've got for example, business where you've got a service offering, you only need 2 or 3 people to listen to the podcast and sign up as a client to justify the podcast in the first sense. So it's important to recognize the value of one podcast listen to you for whatever you're doing. Of course, that's going to change a little bit depending on the goals that you initially set out to do, as we spoke about in the first section here. But it is very important to recognize exactly the currency of what a listen is for a podcast. The next aspect of this is, what is the monetization model? We've got to make it viable. Let's not beat around the bush. We've got to find a way to make your podcast fit in with your business, with your lifestyle, in a way that is going to ensure that you are going to be able to continue doing it for a long time. Because it is the sort of thing, as we see there in the third point, you're not necessarily going to get the return on investment unless you do really stick to this. Podcasting is the sort of thing where it has exponential returns. So really settle in as we look at the third point there for the long game. You're not necessarily going to achieve all the goals that you set out to if you get to that 5 episode mark, as 50% of podcasters do, and go, I haven't achieved everything that I've set out to. This must not necessarily be worth it for me. So you've really got to understand, where can that podcast fit in for you? Where is it going to be possible to keep it going? And what systems can I put in place to make it as easy and efficient as possible for me to ensure that I am able to continue with the podcast in the long term? So if we look at 3 things that we can do to ensure that our podcast doesn't fall into these traps. The first one is set up clear goals and have a clear purpose. The second one, what are my systems for participation? And the third one is link success to goals. Link the success of the podcast to the goals that we initially set out to do. So when we're talking about setting clear goals and purpose, what exactly do you deliver? What is the outcome that you deliver for your audience, as we were speaking about earlier? And how clear are you on that outcome before you start your podcast? Why are you the host? Why are you the best host? And how can you convey to your audience that you are the best host? And who are you talking to? Who is it that is in your target audience, and why is it that you're talking to them? You also want those people in your target audience to be able to self-identify, to think, oh, this person is absolutely speaking only to me. So the more clear we are on these things before we start our podcast, the more we can think about how we can include some of these identification markers in our podcast in terms of saying to our target audience, we're exactly talking to you, saying to our target audience, we're the best host to be talking to you about this. So the more we can be clear about this from the start, the more likely we are to be able to include it. Second point there is clear participation systems. So as we spoke about earlier, where can they get in touch? They may have feedback. They may have questions that they want to ask you. Have you got systems in place to be able to ensure that this podcast isn't just going to stand alone as a bit of audio that people hear and are interested in? We want to create a system around that, which, as we said earlier, signals to our listeners that we're legitimate about this and also gives them an opportunity to communicate with us too. What should they do next? This is both in a systemic sense, in terms of you may want them to go to your website. You may want them to go to an email list and sign up for an email list. You may want them to seek more information about a product or service that you're offering. Well, what they should do next thing is a call to action in that sort of sense. And I've heard people describe that you don't want more than one call to action, because you certainly don't want to overwhelm people and you don't want people to think, oh, I'll get around to it later. There's too much I need to do. So if you can just sort of say, let's continue the conversation here. This is the next thing that you need to do, and this is the most that you can get out of this podcast by doing this. That will allow more people to take action on that step that you've encouraged there. And the what should I do next, that also means in terms of an engagement sort of thing too. So what can people do to help implement the information that you've put in your podcast? Whether it be, is there a little exercise that you can give them that will help them integrate the information that you've spoken about in the podcast into their lifestyle, into their routines and habits? Because as I said, we don't want to just have this as standalone audio that just kind of goes up there and is kind of quaint and nice and people enjoy it. We want to put as many systems in place to allow people to interact with our podcast as much as possible. And sometimes that means while we're not involved as well. So as I say, certainly involving exercises and things that people can do to implement the information is a great step as well. And the third one is, where can people learn more? Exactly what we were talking about there. People are going to want to be more involved. People are going to want more information. We've been achieving outcomes for them. Where can they learn more? Because the thing is, if people are interested in a subject, you may have piqued someone's curiosity about a particular area. You may have got them really interested in something particular. Well, they're going to look for that anyway. So all that's going to happen is, if you don't have that there coming from you, well, they're just going to find that from someone else, and potentially they'll be lost to you as a loyal listener forever. So the more we can put these systems in place, the more we allow people to interact and identify with our podcast as more than just a single piece of audio. The third thing is link success to goals. So as we spoke about earlier, have our clear goals that we've set up. Have we got a system for monetization? Are we going to be able to continue this for more than just those 5 episodes? So you think if 51% of podcasts, most podcasts haven't got past that 5 episode, well, if you can get to say 15 episodes, well, then you think, how much have you already stood out from all other podcasts just by simply getting to that number that so many others haven't been able to get to? The next part of that is create and nurture relationships. This is such an important thing. And as we were talking about before, with the currency of one podcast listen being worth potentially so much more than just a single number as it appears like an Instagram like or a Facebook like, what relationships can you create, and how can you leverage those relationships, whether it be in your business, whether it be in your personal life? One thing that's been huge for podcasting, and in many ways the reason that I got into podcasting, was it gives you an opportunity to pick someone's brain like nothing else ever before. And if you can approach someone and say, hey, I'm really interested in speaking to you on my podcast. You've got value I can deliver to, that you can deliver to my audience. And I want to keep in touch with you. I want to keep connecting with you, and I want to help you as much as I can afterwards. Well, that is such a good way to connect with someone whether they might be an idol of yours who you potentially want as a mentor. They could be a potential business partner down the line. They could be a potential client, a potential employee. You've got to get a bit creative with this sort of stuff because it's such a new medium. There's so many great examples of people using podcasts to achieve whatever goals they have. And such a big part of that is creating and nurturing relationships, because podcasts are probably the best tool that we have for doing that in a professional sense, I believe. And the third and final part of that is aim for thank yous. As I said before, podcasts trade on the currency of connection. And if you think, if someone feels compelled enough to say thank you, they go out of their way to say thank you to you, clearly you've done something for them that has compelled them to do that in the first place. To me, that is such a significant marker of success for a podcast. If you can get someone to come up and say, thank you so much for helping me with this, for changing this for me, for allowing me to do this. It's such a powerful thing in podcasting. I've found after putting stuff out there, you just have so many overwhelmingly positive interactions with people if they do come up to you and say thank you about that sort of stuff. And that is literally the stuff that makes it all worth it. In terms of, obviously, if someone's being compelled enough to say thank you, clearly they're going to be an advocate. They're going to tell other people about your podcast. They're basically going to cover off all the things that you want them to cover off in a business viability sort of sense for the podcast. But I just think beyond that, if someone has felt compelled to say, thank you so much for doing this for me, and having a conversation with that person after that, that is really what makes this sort of stuff all worth it. And it can add so much richness to a professional experience. So thank you so much for watching this video today. Please head over to our website at easygoingdigital.com.au if you'd like any more help with this stuff. Please feel free to get in touch if you're struggling with anything in particular with podcasts. I'll be putting out some videos, some podcasts and some articles in the near future on these social media pages about some of this sort of stuff. We'll drill down into each of the points in a little bit more detail, and we'll also be speaking about a whole range of other things that will help you with your podcast too. So I hope you've been able to get some value out of this video today, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.